Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, March 19th, 2024. For those of you that might be new to this broadcast, every other broadcast we have a live Q&A. And what we do in that is we take questions from the live audience. You can also send in questions at any time to us at webinar@evoketherapy.com. Those questions will go to the top of the queue if they're sent in, and I'll answer them first. So if you're a listener to the podcast and you want some questions addressed, some issues broached, you can send in anything you'd like, suggestions, feedback, anything you want to send to webinar@evoketherapy.com. This is also an opportunity to invite family and friends to the live broadcast. So if you are an Evoke family and you have family that are interested in seeing how they can support you or curious about the programs that we run, you're welcome to have them and attend at any time and share this with them. So with that, let me get to the first question that has come in live. Somebody writes, can you describe the general process that wilderness therapy uses to help those that are struggling? The first thing I would say about it is that wilderness therapy utilizes traditional therapies. So whether it be cognitive behavioral, whether it be dialectical behavioral therapies, whether it be emotionally focused therapy, internal family systems, brain spotting, EMDR, psychodynamic therapy, family systems therapy, all the theories that we have in mental health are available at Evoke. Depends on the therapist you go to, depends on the approach, depends on the diagnosis, of course, or the issues that are presenting themselves. So that's the first thing that I would want you to understand. But what's beautiful about wilderness therapy is you nest that traditional psychotherapy in the context of experiential therapy. And when I say experiential therapy, I'm not talking about games and activities. I'm talking about small group living. You have 6 to 9 clients, 4 staff, and a therapist. And now you have something much more provocative, something that pulls out of the child issues that they might not otherwise know about. There's so much of our trauma that is pre-verbal and nonverbal, and getting access to that trauma, those issues can be very difficult if you're just doing talk therapy. So wilderness therapy, the experience of living outside, working in small groups, having to relate to and communicate with and problem solve with and depend upon each other brings up those issues. So in many cases, we would not need for a child to give us a history or a parent to give us a history of what's going on in the child in a lot of ways because we see it come out in the process. Wilderness therapy is a very intentional, mindful program. Things that we all take for granted living at home, you can't take for granted in the wilderness. And what I love about wilderness therapy most of all is that nature becomes the antagonist, if you will. Nature becomes the teacher. You don't have to give a long lecture on building a shelter when it's starting to rain. The lesson is self-evident. So just like you wouldn't need to teach a farmer the old adage of what you reap is what you sow because it's inherent in their life, so it is with wilderness therapy. All of the issues, all of the relationship issues, all of the ways of coping generally get exposed in the process. So it's traditional therapy on top of the experience. And what the experiential component does for us is not only does it allow us to access issues that might otherwise be unconscious or buried or just not come up during a talk therapy session, but also the experience is a great way of practicing in real time. So you're not just talking about a relationship with the parent, right? Or a relationship with the teacher. You're actually getting to see it in real time. Sometimes this is just an example. It's a very rare occurrence, but once in a while, 2 clients will show up who know each other from home, and the first reaction, of course, is for people to get really worried about that and say, we that's part of the reason why we sent our child to the program is to remove them from the negative context of the negative influence. But what we can do is we can treat their dynamic in real time. Everything becomes grist for the mill. Breakfast becomes grist for the mill. The hike becomes the grist for the mill. The exercises that we do, like building fire by rubbing sticks together, the bow drill fire practice becomes grist for the mill. So whereas a lot of clients are really good at I would say the academic or the intellectual exercise of psychotherapy, eventually The issues, the strengths, the weaknesses are going to be exposed in this process. Wellness therapy, in my experience, is one of the most powerful versions of therapy that I've ever seen. There's also this sounds strange, but there's a huge family focus and even a greater and deeper motivation to do family work because of the separation. In psychology and development, human development, we understand that the development of the self, of the individual personality, ideally has some foundation before we get into intimate relationships in young adulthood or even late adolescence. Ideally, we have some sense of who we are before we go and look for a partner. Otherwise, as what happens with a lot of people, we're inclined to not know who we are and to give that up in relationship. So, developmentally speaking, the separation between parent and a child that is temporary gives everybody an opportunity to psychologically breathe, to figure themselves out, to not be in a reactive or reactionary mode with each other. Back when I first started wilderness therapy in the late mid 90s, actually, when I started it, when I started working wilderness therapy, I was apologetic and frustrated initially with snail mail, with the old letter through the mail system. Because we would get a letter from a parent, we'd give it to a child, the child would write a response and send it back. And in order for the letter for the child to get a letter the following week, when we went out to visit them as therapists, the parents sometimes had to write a letter before they got the response. And I commiserated with parents about the frustrating process of it being slow. But here's what I know now because of the radically immediate accessibility that we all have to communicate with each other. That time and space allows people to get to know themselves better. You start having to speak your truth, not because of the reaction that you're going to get or what you're going to convince somebody of or sell them on, but you start to speak your truth because you don't see the reaction. It's so slow, so not immediate that it gives you the opportunity to mindfully search with what's really going on in your heart, either as a parent and a child. I remember I had one student. We often have phone calls in the middle of the program. We have many visits from parents during the middle of the program, which also is something that we as a wilderness therapy program were the first to institute in the entire country at the time. That wasn't happening anywhere, but we came from the field of family therapy and we saw that as valuable. It's not that all of those visits are celebratory. It's not that everybody just enjoys seeing each other. In fact, if that's the only thing that happens, we're really missing an opportunity. But they get to talk about things in real time and practice and fail and struggle and get coached and have family therapy so that we're not relying on hearsay. We're not relying on self report. We get to see it in the moment and live. I had one student who had worked to earn a phone call with his parents. And what you have to do is earn a phone call. Sometimes it's just a matter of time. We want to see what it looks like when you're on the phone together. Sometimes it's if the child is stalling or not working at their program, then we'll hang that out there for them as a carrot. But essentially, this student had gotten to the point where I thought he was ready for a phone call with his parents, something he'd been looking forward to. And the week that I decided that, I gave him a letter from his father, and his father confessed that he himself had gone to treatment while his son was with us for various aspects around addiction and made some specific confessions around how his addiction may have affected the family. It was a beautiful letter, generous letter, well written letter. So the young man was reading the letter. He was powerfully impacted by it emotionally. He had the space to react. And I mentioned to him later in the session that I think it's time, it's okay if you have a phone call with your parents this week. And with what I can only understand to be just a wisdom beyond his years, he said, I think I want to hold back this week. He said, if I get on the phone with my parents, I will lose myself. I'll end up trying to take care of my dad and his guilt and shame, and I need time to process it. So he went a whole nother week by his choice of not talking to his father. Now, it's not always the client choice when that happens, but it illustrates the value of the separation leading to individuation, leading to a stronger sense of self, which eventually leads to the capacity for greater intimacy. The first ingredient in intimacy, and I'm not talking about romantic intimacy, I'm talking about intimacy between any two people in any two roles. The first fundamental ingredient in intimacy is a sense of self, a sense of knowing who you are. So that distance can provide it. We do fun things, we do games, we do lots of activities. And so there's a whole lot that I could talk about and the way that wilderness therapy supports traditional therapy. But suffice to say, it is a way of bringing traditional therapy to an experiential milieu and in using the best of both worlds to create a wonderful treatment plan and outcome. All right. I'm ready for the next one, Michelle. Okay. Somebody says, what about all the bad press Wilderness is getting right now? Well, what do I want to say about that? I want to say that anybody who has been abused or mistreated by any program or any person should be heard. And so if people have bad experiences, I don't care if it's with my program, I don't care if it's with me, those accusations should be investigated by the proper authorities to the and whatever the consequences are should be followed to the full extent of the law. That's my basic idea. But what I can tell you is that that is a tiny fraction of my experience and the experience of the people that I work with, and how they feel about wilderness therapy. I will tell you that I've talked to many reporters, and they don't want to know about the success stories. They want to know about the exciting stories. It's just like the news. Some of you might have heard that old adage of on the news that if it bleeds, it leads. And I have spent 25 years talking to journalists, and when I talk about a subtle, beautiful, healing story in a family, their eyes glass over in the board. If I talk about a dramatic incident where a kid threw a tantrum and tried to run away, or something more dramatic like that, they want to write about that. So it's hard to report on the healing process. And when people come to me saying that they were mistreated or abused, my response is I'm sorry. And I want to hear them. I've had students come to me complaining about my therapy with them. And in almost every instance, all they needed to do was to be heard by me. I may have made a mistake in my approach. They may have felt that I missed them or I shamed them in some way. And I'm sure I've done that in my career. I'm sure I've done that. I know I've done that. I'm a much, much better therapist in 2024 than I was in 2004. And I hope if I keep doing this, I'll be a much better therapist in 2044 than I am in 2024. So the press is exciting and interesting to people. I think it's each individual case deserves to be honored. Each individual client and child deserves to be honored. And I don't want to say anything about that more than that, but it's not my experience. I've had two of my own children in our program, and both of them to this day will tell you it was one of the most impact. They didn't love it, especially the first one, by any means, but they will tell you that it was one of the most meaningful and enriching process of their lives. In fact, my oldest came back and worked for us. He felt so strong about it, so moved by it. My third child, who went, used his experience on his wilderness experience to write his college essays that got him into college, the college that he wanted to go to. And he says to this day that part of it, as difficult as it was the most spiritual experience in his life. I'm going to tell you one secret about the bad press as it relates to a personal level and to each parent and each family. If your child comes back and says that they felt like it was a mistake and that you did the wrong thing and that it hurt them, my recommendation to you is to say, I'm sorry. I mean, if it needs to be investigated, follow the rule of law, right? Follow the legal system to have anything that needs to get done to get done. But if it's just that was a mistake and you overreacted and they didn't need to go and it was emotionally painful for them, my response that I would encourage, the response that I would encourage would be to say, "I'm sorry. I'm glad you're talking about it. It might have been the wrong thing. I didn't know what else to do, and you have every right to be angry and sad and hurt by it, and I'll listen." Now, if that continues and it's about badgering and punishing you, obviously setting a boundary is what I would encourage. But I believe that part of the reason that these children who have struggled with mental illness issues are complaining to the press and on social media is because there's a voice where they feel like they don't have one. And so, because I, as a owner, can never respond to anybody's claims whatsoever, I'm bound by the rules of confidentiality, and as is our program, I can't even acknowledge that that person was in our program or not. It's a wonderful place to target. It's a wonderful place to target because nobody's gonna listen to them if they write a story about how their parents were emotionally abusive to them, right? That's not gonna make the news. That's not gonna make Netflix or USA Today. So I'm mixed about it. I have compassion for people who've been mistreated. I have compassion for my clients who had to experience a younger version of me as a therapist. I have compassion for my older children who had to experience a younger version of me as a parent, for sure. I was just talking to my youngest the other day. I have a 31-year-old, a 29-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a 16-year-old. And I was just talking to them the other day. I was just saying the version of me that the older ones had to deal with was tougher. It would have been tougher. It's not effortless today to be my child, but by a significant margin, my first two, 15, 16 years ago, they got a more raw, unpolished, unhealed, unaware, unconscious version of me in many ways. Thanks for the question. It's tough. Somebody writes, "My daughter will only be there a week come tomorrow. Our first conversation with her therapist was non-surprising in that she is nonchalant about the whole thing. How do you handle a girl who doesn't seem bothered by anything? She doesn't understand how the choices she was making don't work for her." Eventually, inevitably, she is exposed, and I mean that in a healthy way. Like her issues come to the surface. First of all, the setting is very provocative, right? It's hard to hide. Have you ever quit smoking? Have you ever gone on a diet before? Have you ever cut something out of your life that offered you comfort? All of us just went through the pandemic and the lockdown recently, and you know that feeling of anxiety and depression that many of us experienced after the lockdowns set in after a while. When we have our outlets, our escapes walled off, blocked off, barricaded, our issues come out the front door. So the environment will do it. Time will do it. Peers, that's what I wanted to get to. Peers will do it for us. Peers don't stomach hypocrisy very much. They just don't like it. They don't like it in us adults, and they don't like it in each other and peers. So that will eventually be exposed. Sometimes a child, not nonchalant, but sometimes a child does very well throughout the program. That's not bad news. That tells us that the problem might have been contextual. It could have been academic, school related. It could have been family system related. It could be a specific trauma that now they're in treatment is so far away, it's not triggering them. It can be exposure to screens or social. There could be a whole lot of reasons why a child would do well and be non-symptomatic here, whereas they would be symptomatic at home. So part of our job is assessment, is to answer that question. Why? Not just answer it ourselves, but ask it of the child and the family. What are we seeing here? Why is it going so well? I want to say this to you. This goes back to the other question about wellness therapy. In some ways, wellness therapy is the easiest place. In some ways, it's really hard. But in other ways, it's the easiest, safest place that the child will ever be in their entire life. And I have seen that and I have heard that told to me over the years many, many times because there's always therapy, there's always support. There's always somebody to talk to. There's always a group or a staff member or a therapist who's willing to help somebody sort through difficult emotions, sort through difficult problems, communication issues, conflict. And so we definitely think of it being primitive living, right? Living outside camping. And we think about the challenges and the discomfort that comes with that experience. But psychologically, very few things wrap around the child with more support than does wilderness therapy. So eventually she'll be exposed. Eventually her issues will come up. And if by chance she is one of the rare exceptions where she does well all throughout it, doesn't look at all like she did at home, then we have to answer that question. That has to be part of our assessment and recommendation going forward. Somebody writes, I have a grandson in wilderness now. How can I best support him and his mom? First of all, showing up here is a great support, and asking that question is your second decision. I really strongly encourage extended family members to read some of the assignments that the child is being asked to read. We have the Knight in Rusty Armor. I have a podcast on everything I'm about to tell you. I have a podcast on it too. So if you want the Reader's Digest version of it, you can listen to the podcast. First of all, I would encourage you to listen to the podcast, a handful of ones. Um, Go to an Al-Anon meeting or Codependence Anonymous meeting. At the end of every broadcast, I ask all current parents, I'll do that now. I ask all current parents to just try 6 of any of the following support groups: alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. You can also try refugerecovery.org, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness also has free classes and resources in your local communities. So anything that you're willing to do to be exposed to what they're being exposed to is wonderful. And by the way, it makes you a better spouse, person, friend, boss, employee, grandparent, citizen, neighbor. It's all the same work. Specifically, if you want to read something from the bird's eye view, my 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, there's the first one, written really from my experience as a wilderness therapist, and kind of understanding how to help families deal with a child, cope with a child, support a child who's struggling with mental health issues or addiction. So the journey of the heroic parent is an option. And then I wrote The Audacity to Be You. It's kind of its sequel, not really related to having a child, but more about our individual journeys, whether we're thinking of ourselves in terms of a grandparent, a parent, a spouse, a friend, or just an individual. So those come from this work specifically, but you want to take away the stigma. You want to communicate that everybody has mental health issues. Everybody has mental health issues. Mental health and mental illness is a continuum that we are all on. Some of us are farther along on one end of the continuum or another. That's a fact. But what I would most want you to realize from exposure to any of the things that I'm describing tonight, whether it be my books, whether it be the 12-step meetings, whether it be the Knight in Rusty Armor that we ask our clients to read, or any specific book or assignment that they're reading, is we want to narrow the gap between you and them. We want you to have the same experience that they're having right now in the wilderness, which is, yeah, you might not have the same problem. You might not have stole drugs from your grandmother's medicine cabinet. You might not have stole money from your parents, or lied, or broke a hole in a wall, in frustration and a tantrum when you didn't get your way. You don't relate to the specific events, but everybody knows what it's like to betray their own integrity. Everybody knows what it's like to self-medicate. Everybody knows what it's like to be in a relationship where you love the other person, and they love you, and there still seems to be conflict that you just can't quite get over. So for me, the best way that you could support your grandchild, is to expose yourself to the mental health literature, to understand it, and to not think of you up here and them down here. You're the healthy one who knows everything, and they're the ones who are mentally ill. I will tell you this, sort of in a conclusion to this question. Um, Your grandchild, in some ways, will know more about mental health and its tools than you will. Probably knows more than you do right now. Doesn't mean they can operate at a mentally healthy level, right? That comes with maturity and time and building the more basic structures of the self, of the psyche. But they would recognize communication. They'd recognize passive aggressive communication. They'd recognize blaming language. They'd recognize shaming and guilting behaviors. They'd recognize a whole bunch of things. Kids that struggle with this, I was one of them. Kids that struggle with this stuff, they don't come out of this process and in spite of the struggles that they have, they make it in the world. Kids who come out of this process because of their experience and struggle have more gifts and wisdom and insight to offer to the world. It's a fact. So if you have the luxury of having good mental health, if you have the privilege of having grown up in a family where there was not very many mental health issues, if that's your privilege, that's your luxury, you also miss out on some of the opportunities that come from the struggle. We learn in psychology that where our wounds are and our struggles are, there are our gifts, right? They're often very closely connected to each other. I would assume that part of whatever I can offer the world as a therapist comes in large part, not in spite of my struggles, but because of my struggles. And because I found the support that I needed to get me through it. And now I have some sense of what other people need. So I would honor them by doing some of the work that I've mentioned. Great, great question. Same with his mom. Yeah, I think it was a, yeah, you said grandson. Same with his mom. Just support her. And if you really want the PhD in this process as a grandparent, this is going to be a hard one for most people. Be open to the fact that you have some contribution to this issue. I know, and I know it more now than I did 20 years ago because of the personal work that I've done. I know that I have dented my children. I also know that I was dented as a child, speaking symbolically, psychologically. And I know that the dents that I put in my children will impact their ability to parent their children. And people who go through this process and become more aware, more conscious, more enlightened, they know that. And I suspect because you posted that question, because you're attending this broadcast live, that you might be one of those people who can get past the ego of being a good grandparent, a good parent, and be a human parent, a human grandparent. And there's no greater support that you can offer to your daughter and to her son than your humanness. And I could it could almost bring me to tears. I wish my grandparents could have done that for my mother. She still suffers to this day at her advanced age because of some of the dents of her parents and her childhood that she hasn't been able to work out. So, great question. Have you heard of the new book by Abigail Schreier? She wrote Irreversible Damage. The book is Bad Therapy: Why Kids Aren't Growing Up. She is claiming the worst, the worst Gen Z mental health issues isn't the problem, but the poor mental health experts. Just wondering if you've heard about it, and you can comment. Glad you asked that. I actually wrote a review. I wrote one of the one-star reviews on her Amazon. It is, in my opinion, a completely irresponsible and ignorant book. And I wrote a post. I actually wrote to NPR, who had her on. One of the hosts at NPR had her on as a guest, and I wrote a very detailed, a short but detailed critique of the book. And then they wrote back to me and asked me to write a longer critique, and they were going to share it with the editorial team, which I did do immediately. Um, it's just not good science. It's just not true. She doesn't have a knowledge of child development, nor does she have a knowledge of psychology or even mental health. So if you go on there and you click on the one-star reviews on Amazon, you can see my short criticism of it. But her one of her main premises is that mental health professionals are over pathologizing children, are over diagnosing children, and this over pathologizing and this over diagnosing is contributing to children's lack of resiliency and fragility. That's her claim. And she says parents are abdicating their responsibility and outsourcing their parental responsibility and obligations to these mental health professionals. That's her claim. But my question is why? Why would a parent today, 2024, outsource and abdicate their responsibility and duties as a parent to a mental health professional? I won't do that. I'm not even tempted to do that. But that's another story. But why would somebody do that? And the fact of the matter is, developmentally speaking, and the science is clear, is these parents don't know themselves, are anxious themselves, grew up in families where someone else had the answer, some authority figure had the answer for them. So if you grew up as a child and the parents know what's best and know what's right, and you grew up believing that, guess what happens when you become an adult? You assume that somebody else, some authority figure, and she makes the point that parents can be intimidated by these ultimate authority figures, but that's a wound in the child who's now a parent. And that parent grew up in a time when we weren't inundated with mental health issues. So her logic falls short. It's similar to a critique that I made about another book years ago, about another idea from a book that said previous generations of parents and children, what they said about them is, you hear this sometimes still, that in previous generations, the child worried about what the parent thought about them. But today, the parent worries about what the child thinks about them. I'll repeat that. The claim is in previous generations, the child worried about what the parent thought about them, whereas today, the parent worries about what the child thinks about them. Guess what? It's the same person during the worrying. If you grow up being a people pleaser, if you grow up in a house where the parent thinks that they know your truth, you grow up to be an adult who's a people pleaser. Parent pleasers turn into people pleasers, and you don't know yourself. And the task of developing a healthy self in a child involves mistakes and great capacity on the parent's part. I don't teach or lecture my 4 children, hardly ever. They hear me doing it in the background all the time on these broadcasts, so they don't need more of me. But I try to support them as they bumble their way through it and figure themselves out. I had a child that just recently went through a series of decisions that some parents might say, "Oh, you could have prevented that. You could have advised them. You could have directed them." And I said to my wife, I said, "This is how you figure yourself out." And the reason that I'm not inclined to outsource my parenting to some expert is because I've figured out who I was in the process. So I think our book is irresponsible and it's ignorant. It's just not good science. It's anecdotal and it's actually just silly. It makes no sense whatsoever. And of course there are bad therapists. I spend my career trying to teach and foster good therapy. So I believe that happens for sure. But her accusation, the fact that a parent came to the conclusion it's somebody else's fault for children's mental health issues today is is very, very convenient. That she came to the conclusion that it's not parents, which virtually every single child psychologist on the planet knows. Carl Jung said that parents must be conscious of the fact that they themselves are the principal cause of their children's neuroses. That's what therapy gets you to do, gets you to realize. So the fact that she came to the conclusion that the problem is out there is just all too convenient. It's indicative of her own mental illness, frankly. I feel pretty strong about it. I don't usually rate things and I don't write letters to interviewers and to NPR. That's not I don't have time for that, but I felt so strongly about it because a friend of mine had suggested it and I wanted to see what it was about. And I read it and it was absurd, silly. And part of the reason, by the way, let me just say this before I move on. Part of the reason why I do these broadcasts and talk to parents, I don't just talk to parents of children in our program, but part of the reason why I try to educate you all about psychotherapy is so that you can be an informed consumer, so that you don't fall into that trap of assuming that the therapist has it figured out and the therapist is the model of health. We're crazy, just like you are. Our expertise, as I wrote in The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is not in telling you what to do in your life. Our expertise ought to be in helping you figure out what you need to do with your life. That's our expertise, creating a process where you discover your truth. And all, all therapeutic licensing organizations across the United States, all of them, all of them have in there that a therapist is not to give advice when it comes to major life decisions. So it's in our DNA. We don't give it, we give advice less than lay people do, frankly. And the master therapist prides themselves on what they don't know and their uncertainty. Whereas parents, people, lay people pride themselves on what they do know. So yeah, you touched on a nerve of mine. Thanks for asking it. Somebody writes, the last time we were with our son, he blew up at us for a basic question. My husband and I think that it might be time for him to be retested for his medication. He has said that he'd like to go back into therapy, but he keeps dragging his feet. Could you suggest how we as parents might help him to help himself? I guess you can I don't know his age. I don't know if he's home now after having been in a program. So I don't know those specifics, but you can offer it, you know, and you can hold your boundaries with how he treats you, how he talks to you as you feel comfortable, as you feel it's appropriate. And if you have more bandwidth and more capacity, you can tolerate a little bit more of the mess, a little bit more of the mess as you go along. But it sounds like he knows what he needs. Sounds like he's considered. I would hold this opinion lightly. All four of my children have been in psychotherapy. All four of my children. None of them were required. None of them none of them did I even make a strong suggestion to. But they do it because I do it. They do it because my wife does it. They do it because they know that it benefits us. And when they get mad at us, I tease them and I say, "This is your father on therapy. Just think how bad it would be if I wasn't in therapy." Of course, I'm teasing. But therapy is not, I don't think of it as work. I think of it as somebody to be there for me once a week where I can find myself and sort my things out. I don't have to take care of the therapist. And then the parent-child relationship, the child generally feels that they have to take care of the parent. The parent has a dog in the fight. The parent doesn't want, I'm a parent, so I'll say about myself too. We parents don't want our children to hurt. We don't want them to be sad. We don't want them to be upset. It triggers a biological need in us to soothe our children. That's in our DNA, right? So the therapist offers something fundamentally different than the parents. If you read the introduction, the forward to The Audacity to Be You, my book, you'll hear my therapist, who's a prolific writer, you'll hear her describe the difference between a parent and a child. I remember my daughter said to me one time, my youngest, we were driving to therapy, and she said, "I don't know what to talk to my therapist about today." And I said, I don't know what you should talk to her about. I have no idea. Can never answer that question. And I said, but if she starts to give you advice when you're sharing, tell her that you don't need advice, that you already have parents. And I was making a joke, of course, teasing us as parents and our proclivity to give advice. So I would model it for him. That's my, this probably won't be a popular answer, but I would model it. Absolutely. I would go to therapy and show them the benefits of it, make it available to them, hold your boundaries. Sometimes the boundaries lead them into therapy, meaning that they have to find an outlet for their anger and rage. And because they act it out on you in inappropriate ways, The boundary forces them into a situation where they need to find somebody to talk to who's a safe, non-reactive person, non-judgmental person. All right, somebody writes, "How do you help the child that doesn't know they act the way they do?" It's a great question. You don't. You just do your thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess I do sometimes say it to my children. I see. Here's the secret. Since there are a lot of family members on here today, I'm going to give you the secret, and this is universally proven in statistics and research. The greatest predictor of your ability to parent a child is how much work you've done on yourself. There's really no close second, no close substitute. If you have unraveled your trauma, and you do have trauma, more than some, less than others, you'll be able to see your child. Carl Jung says that the best way to understand somebody else's darkness is to understand your own darkness. So it's not about what you can teach them. I was saying to my wife the other day, a couple weeks ago, in parenting, I was making an observation. In parenting, my goal is to run my big decisions through what I'll call the attachment filter. The attachment filter says that the most important thing in child development is a solid, healthy, secure relationship with an adult caregiver. And again, the research is overwhelming on that point. So, what that means is I don't try to control their dating practices, whether or not they cheat in school. I try not to get distracted by if they're self harming, if they're abusing substances. I can have limits and consequences for all those things, but I try not to get distracted by those things. I try to think the most important thing is that they feel safe with me, so that if they're in a jam, they call me. That when they screw something up and make a big mistake, that I'm the safe person that they go to. The thing about parenting, it's not about what you think you're teaching them. It's not about your lectures or your analogies or your short little moral stories. That doesn't really move the needle when it comes to parenting and child development. What it is it's a secure attachment, a safe place, a non-judgmental, non-reactive, non-anxious place to be. And here is the caveat, not caveat. Here is the golden nugget. Anxiety is the silent killer, if you will. Parental anxiety and worry about a child gets internalized to the child by the child. It gets internalized as something is wrong with me. So you have to take care of your fear in another place. If you show up to the child anxious, it's not going to go well. You might not see it immediately, but it will not go well. But if you have a support group, a therapist, a trusted mentor, a co-parent that you trust, deal with your anger and your sadness and your fear there so the child doesn't have to carry it. Children are not built to carry your pain, your anxiety. It's not their job. It's the other way around. Absolutely. So it's not so much about pointing out the way that they act or not. It's about becoming yourself, healing, growing, becoming enlightened, getting enough enlightenment, enough awareness, enough consciousness that you have something to apologize for. I joke and I say to people, go to therapy until you realize what apologies you need to make to the people that are close to you. I had a mother one time model accountability to her son when he said in a rage, "You've judged me my whole life. You judged my friends who didn't go to our church. He said to her, you made me a liar," he said. And I thought to myself, oh, he took it too far with that one because the parent's going to come back and say, nobody can make you a liar. That's your responsibility. I was expecting this parent to say that. And the mother said, you're right. I did do those things. I was anxious. I did judge people that were different than you, that were different than us. And the boy relaxed. And after the session ended, the mother came to me and she said, but how do I teach him about honesty and integrity. How do I teach them to be accountable? And I said to her, "You just did. You did more by modeling your participation in the problem than you would have ever done had you tried to show him what he was doing and what he was responsible for. You showed him what it meant to be an adult." And to be frank with you, most of us don't have experience with those kinds of adults. A healthy, wise adult will apologize, not be an apologist, not be a victim, not be a martyr, but apologize when they make mistakes. They'll know that they're imperfect, they'll know that they're human. Whereas an unhealthy parent will say things like, "We were good parents, there's nothing for them to be that upset about." Or, "They had a good childhood, I don't know what you're talking about with trauma." That's what an unhealthy parent says. A healthy parent says, "Yeah, it might have been better than most, but I know how hard it is to live with me. I have to live with me. And I can only imagine what it must be like to be my child. And I want to be open to and listen to that." All right, I have time for one more question. Somebody writes, "How does a parent pull the trigger for a wilderness program when they feel so deep down that it's the right decision for them, but get stuck in the fear of worrying about the initial process that will traumatize the child? They feel that the child will feel abandoned." I don't push parents to make the trigger, to pull the trigger, to make the decision. I think what I'd say is just talk to other families who've been through it. Anytime you make a decision like this, it is a betrayal. In fact, in family systems theory, the theory that family therapy is built on, they talk about healthy betrayal. If 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 you and I are in a marriage and you're drinking and you're yelling and you once in a while slap me and I put up with it. If I draw the line someday and say I'm leaving, I'm not going to do this anymore. If you don't get treatment, whatever the line in the sand is, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of the implicit contract. So you don't get to get out of this parenting thing being good or being right. You get to get out of it being a person, being a self, which is so much better. So if your child gets mad at you for betraying them, for sending them away, for abandoning them, listen, hear it. If the worst thing you do is in a moment of crisis where you think that your child's life is at risk or their health is at risk or the development is at risk, if the worst thing you do is send your child to a program against their will, you would be, in my book, the greatest parent that ever lived. The amount of mistakes I've made in my parenting is limitless. Now, I want to tell you, just to bring this to a close, 31 years ago, when my first child was born, I thought my children were going to be the luckiest children on the planet. Their dad, I'm going to be present. I'm going to be better than my dad in that way. I'm going to be emotionally aware and communicative with my feelings. And I'm going to learn and study child psychology. So my attitude was, when my first son was born, was congratulations, I'm your father. You won the parent lottery. Today, 31 years later, I can see so clearly the mistakes that I've made over the years. I can see clearly the mistakes that I make in the present day. But my ability to see my mistakes is my greatest gift to my children. I'm modeling for them what you do when you make mistakes, what you do. See, the goal in psychotherapy is not to become good. The goal is to become human, to become a person. If you pay attention to movies and stories and even mythology, it's the same story. And just to borrow one example of countless examples, if you saw the Barbie movie, it was moving away from perfection and plasticity to being a human, which is messy. Your children don't need perfect parents. If they do, they are doomed. They need human parents. They need parents who take on the responsibility of their own happiness. They need parents who do not believe that you are only as happy as your least happy child, because that puts a lot of pressure onto the child. They need parents to wake up to the generational, intergenerational messages and traumas that have gone unnoticed, small, big, and everywhere in between. That's what your children need. They don't need you to have all the answers and get it right. If they need that, they are absolutely doomed. Thank you, and thank you for the family members for attending today. I hope it's helpful. All right, folks, like I mentioned earlier, my two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive, if you want to start this work, I cannot think of anything better than attending our Finding You program. It's a perfect springboard into, and if you don't want to go to ours, go to Onsite, go to the House of Ocala, go to the Meadows program in Arizona, their program called um, the Survivors Program. Go to Bridge to Recovery. Go to one of these programs that have you go back and look at your upbringing, your childhood, your conditioning, and then bring it into the present day and see why, understand why you're stuck in certain contexts, situations, relationships today. So our version is called Finding You. April 10th is the next offering. We have an online offering that lasts 2.5 days. May 17th through 19th is that offering. We have custom for families and co-parents and couples. Just contact intensives@evoketherapy.com to find out more. We have support groups for current and alumni parents of our wellness program. March 21st, 2 days from now, is that next offering at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni parent only meeting. April 15th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is that offering. And then for our intensives and coaching clients, we have April 8th at 6 p.m. Contact support groups at evoketherapy.com or go to our website. If you want to work with a coach that works at Evoke that has experience with attachment theory and the things that I've been describing tonight, they can help you with marital issues, stage of life issues, reintegrating a child back to home, parenting, co-parenting, all the issues that we've talked about tonight. Contact coaching at evoketherapy.com to be matched up. Like I said, we ask all parents to just try 6 of any combination of Al-Anon, CODA.org, Families Anonymous, or AdultChildren.org. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just go there and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. Like us and subscribe there. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer, or you can go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the video rebroadcast of these with the slides and the video. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on X, Threads, and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy. And you can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our website has a wonderful blog that is kept up by our employees that are not just talking about what you need to know, but are sharing their own journey toward healing and awareness. All right, folks, I'm going to talk to you tomorrow night. I'm going to talk more about addiction and self-medicating behaviors in all of us. I'll talk about addiction and the addiction model as we understand it, but I'll also talk about it more broadly and how that extends into all self-medicating behaviors, all symptoms that we all have that help us to cope with sometimes overwhelming and distressful feelings, events, and circumstances. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for the family and friends, siblings, for the parents, and for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you. Thank you for showing up to this and being willing to do your work. It makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you tomorrow night. Take care. Bye-bye.